So anyway, so that's all to say that I don't think there's any simple explanation for how these stories have the power that they have. I really don't. I don't think you can reduce it to political conspiracy, that's for sure. I don't think you can reduce it to psychological infantilism. I think you can make a case, like I have, that they are repositories of the collective wisdom of the human race. I had an interesting letter this week from someone. I get a lot of interesting letters. I think I'm going to make an archive out of them and put them on the web at some point, with people's permission, obviously. And he said that he'd been following my lectures and noted that I had been making what you might describe as a quasi-biological or evolutionary case for the emergence of the information that the stories contain. And he said, well, how do you know that someone from a different religious tradition or speaking of a different religious tradition couldn't do exactly the same thing? And I thought, well, first of all, to some degree they could, because there is overlap. Like I've talked to you a little bit about Taoism, for example, in the Taoist view of being as, you know, the eternal balance between chaos and order. One thing I didn't tell you, I don't think about that, and I don't know if you know this, but there's a neuropsychologist named Elkonin Goldberg, who was a student of Alexander Luria. And Luria was, I think, the greatest neuropsychologist of the 20th century. He was a Russian. And he was one of the first people to really determine, in large part, the function of the frontal cortex, which was quite a mystery for a very long period of time. And Goldberg, you know how we have two hemispheres, right? We have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, and people often think of the left for right-handed people, right-handed males more particularly, because women are more neurologically diffuse. It's one of the things that makes them more robust to head injury, for example. And maybe men are less diffuse and somewhat more specialized, which makes them a bit more specialized, but a little more subject to damage. Anyways, we have two hemispheres, the left and the right, and no one exactly knows why. And we know that they house quasi-independent consciousnesses, because if you divide the corpus callosum that unites them, which was done in cases of intractable epilepsy, for example, that each hemisphere is capable of developing its own consciousness to some degree. The right generally non-verbal and the left verbal. And so there has been this idea that the left is a verbal hemisphere and the right is a non-verbal hemisphere. But that can't be right, because of course animals don't talk and they have a bifurcated hemisphere. So if it's right, it's not causally right. Now Goldberg hypothesized instead that the hemispheres were specialized for routinization and non-routinization, or for novelty and familiarity, or for chaos and order. And so that's pretty damn cool. When I ran across that, I also thought about that as a signal of what would you call it? Multi-method, multi-trait construct validation, because I'd never thought of the hemispheres as operating that way, and Goldberg came up with this in a historical pathway that was entirely independent from any mythologically inspired thinking, completely independent. In fact, it was motivated more by materialist Russian neuropsychology, which was materialist for political reasons and also for scientific reasons. But the idea is that we have one hemisphere that reacts very rapidly to things we don't know, and it's more imaginative and diffuse, and it's associated more with negative emotion, because negative emotion is what you should feel immediately when you encounter something you don't understand. Because it's a form of thinking, right? Negative emotion, it's like, I'm somewhere where things aren't what they should be. The right hemisphere does that, generates images very rapidly to help you figure out what might be there. And then the left hemisphere takes that and develops it into something that's more articulated and algorithmic and fully understood. And so then there's this dynamic balance between the right and the left hemisphere, where the left tries to impose order on the world. That's Ramachandran, who's a neurologist in California, a very famous neurologist, who also developed a theory like Goldberg's, who said that the left hemisphere imposes routinized order on the world, and the right hemisphere generates novelty and reacts to novelty and generates novel hypotheses. And he thought, and there is some good evidence for this, that's what's happening during the dream is that information is moved from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere in small doses, basically, so that the novel revelations of the right hemisphere don't demolish the algorithmic structures that the left hemisphere has so carefully put together. So and I like that theory too, because it also does help justify the hypothesis that I've been laying out for you, which is that, you know, there's part of us that extends ourselves out into the world and tries to understand what we don't know, and that part extends itself out with behavior and also with emotion and also with image, and then maybe with poetry, and then maybe with storytelling, and then as that develops, then we develop more and more articulated representations of that emergent knowledge. And so you can map that quite nicely onto the neurologists and the neuropsychologists' presumption about what constitutes the reason for the hemispheric differentiation. But the other thing that's so cool about the hemispheric differentiation argument, as far as I'm concerned, and this is worth thinking about, man, because it's a real, there's a word that Ned Flanders uses for that. Noggin scratcher? I think it's something like that. Anyways, you know, we do make the assumption that what it is that we are biologically adapted to is reality, right? It's actually an axiomatic definition, if you're a Darwinian, because nature is what selects. By definition, that's what nature is. It's what selects. And if the nature that selects has forced upon you a dual hemispheric structure because half of you has to deal with chaos and half of you has to deal with order, then you can make a pretty damn strong inferential case that the world is made out of chaos and order. And that's really something to think about, man, you know. So you can think about that for a while if you want. So anyways, for whatever reason, there is a lot packed into these stories. And so let's investigate a couple more of them. We'll start with this story of Adam and Eve. Now, you may remember that the Bible is a series of books. Bible actually means something akin to library, and these books were written by all sorts of different people and groups of editors and groups of people who edited over and over across very, very large periods of time. So they're authored by no one and many at the same time. There was a tradition for a long time that the earliest books were written by Moses, but that's probably not technically correct, even though it might be dramatically correct, let's say, or correct in the way that a fairy tale is correct. And I'm not trying to put down fairy tales by saying that. But there's a number of authors, and the way the authors have been identified, tentatively, is by certain stylistic commonalities across the different stories, different uses of words, like the words for God, different poetic styles, different topics, and so forth. And people have been working for probably 200 years, roughly that, to try to sort out who wrote what and how that was all cobbled together. But it doesn't really matter for our purposes. What matters is that it's an aggregation of collected narrative traditions, and maybe you could say it's an aggregation of collected narrative wisdom. We don't have to go that far, but we can at least say it's aggregated narrative traditions, and that there was some reason that those traditions and not others were kept, and that there were some reasons, complex though they may have been, why they were sequenced in the order that they were sequenced. Because one of the things that's really remarkable about the Bible as a document is that it actually has a plot, and that's really something. I mean, it's sprawling and it goes many places, but the fact that something's been cobbled together over several thousand years, maybe 4,000 years, maybe longer than that if you include the oral traditions that preceded it, and God only knows how old those are, that collective imagination, part of the human collective imagination has cobbled together a library with a plot. And like I see the Bible as an attempt, a collective attempt by humanity to solve the deepest problems that we have. And I think those problems are the problems of, primarily the problem of self-consciousness. The fact that not only are we mortal and that we die, but that we know it. And that's the unique predicament of human beings. And it makes all the difference. And I think that's laid out in Adam and Eve, in the story of Adam and Eve. I think the reason that makes us unique and is laid out in that story. And interestingly, and I really realized this only after I was doing the last 3 lectures. So the Bible presents a cataclysm at the beginning of time, which is the emergence of self-consciousness in human beings, which puts a rift into the structure of being. That's the right way to think about it. And that's really given cosmic significance. Now, you can dispense with that and say, well, nothing that happens to human beings is of cosmic significance because we're these short-lived, mold-like entities that are like cancers on this tiny little planet that's rotating out in the middle of nowhere on the edge of some unknown galaxy in the middle of infinite space, and nothing that happens to us matters. And it's fine, you can walk down that road if you want. I wouldn't recommend it. I mean, and that's part of the reason I think that for all intents and purposes, it's untrue. You know, it isn't a road you can walk down and live well. In fact, I think if you really walk down that road and you really take it seriously, you end up not living at all. So it's certainly very reminiscent. I mean, I've talked to lots of people who are suicidal and seriously suicidal, and you know, the kind of conclusions that they draw about the utility of life prior to wishing for its cessation are very much like the kind of conclusions that you draw if you walk down that particular line of reasoning long enough. If you're interested in that, you could read Tolstoy's Confessions, Leo Tolstoy's Confession. It's a very short book. It's a killer, man. It's a powerful book, very, very short. And Tolstoy describes his obsession with suicide when he was at the height of his fame. Most well-known author in the world, you know, huge family, international fame, wealth beyond anyone's imagining at that time, influential, admired. He had everything that you could possibly imagine that everyone could have, and for years he was afraid to go out into his barn with a rope or a gun because he thought he'd either hang himself or shoot himself. And he did get out of that. And he describes why that happened and where he went when that happened. And so if you're interested in that, that's a very good book. But